Hi, and welcome to developing a clear and concise writing style, or more simply, how to write. This is the week 9 lecture, and this week I'm going to again try to just keep this pretty short, because really what you should do is read the 3 readings. They're super important, and honestly, this is not so much about just this particular class, but these are some of the most fundamental skills that you're going to get at university, and that which will set you up for a professional job in the real world. So I've decided to move this lecture to week 9 so that you can use this in your essays. You're all going to be writing essays presumably for your other classes, and my hope is that what you read and listen to this week will help you get a high distinction, A plus, whatever it's called, for your at least one of your essays this semester. I have to say that in writing this, I'll be very honest, I used to be a terrible writer when I was in, it's embarrassing to say, but when I did my high school like HSC leaving exam for English, I actually failed my my trial HSC English exam. Very embarrassing. And honestly, I was a pretty bad writer till I was about 21. And the thing that really transformed me was reading this one of these readings here, which is called Strunk White Elementary Principles of Composition, and also another book which I've never been able to find again that was recommended by a lecturer. These 2 books really showed me how to put together an essay and how to write well, and I hope that in putting these together I can help you as well to get much higher marks and to just be a much better, clearer writer and communicator. Okay, so let's get right on with it. Okay, this week there are 3 readings, and the first reading is by yours truly, myself, and it's and the other 2 are real classics. I'm sorry to impose my own writing on you, but I do think it's quite useful. I've used it for many years, and I've had a lot of feedback and on it working. So let's hope it works for you as well. The first reading on how to write a short paper is not particularly about, and I got to say, most of this is not about just how, this is not the skills for just writing the report for this class, the last week's report. This is about generic writing skills, generic non-fiction, so sort of essay and report writing skills to set you up for the working world. And in this first reading, the background, so you understand where it's coming from, is it was written because I was getting students to just write a page essay, 1 page. I got them to write like 3 one-page essays over the course of the semester, as well as other stuff. And for these 1-page essays, I focused on simply getting them to put together and explain a few concepts, give some vivid examples, and that way write something that was very just clear and logical. So some of the elements of how to write a short paper are might seem a little bit off, especially because it talks about how you give examples and analogies and so forth. But overall, the principles of it are very common to almost all non-fiction writing. The second reading, Strunk White, is the classic, I think it's more than 70 years old now, piece of writing that's given to journalists and other professional writers. It outlines the style of a very classic modern writing style that's easy to read and clear. If you want to see an example of that, I think the best example is probably The Economist magazine that comes out every week. read through that and you will see what very masterful writing looks like. And then Reading 3 is another classic. It's from about 1946, I think, just after World War II, and it's by the famous George Orwell, who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm, amongst other things. And this is a very simple essay where he talks about the problems with the English language and suggests some cures. This is an essential reading and an absolute classic. So let's go through them briefly. I'll overview them because I think actually, if I'm going to be honest with you, I think actually reading all of these is much better than my summary is going to be as a lecture. But yep, you want a lecture. Many of you like having this explained to you, so I will talk you through it. So reading 1, how to write a short paper. The core of how to write a short paper is that bad writing has benefits. It's saying that you need to be brave if you want to forego the benefits of bad writing and become a good writer. The most important benefit of bad writing, I think, is that when you write badly, it's very hard to be wrong. No one can fully, clearly understand you. You can you don't have to be super clear about exactly what point you're making. And this, I think you need to see this as we all see bad writing. We need to all understand that bad writing often brings us, it helps us feel sort of safe, right? The main reason for that is that good writing is incredibly simple, precise, and clear, not simplistic. And when you're forced to be clear and say what you mean and really communicate, you feel naked at some level, and it takes bravery to put your ideas out there in a naked form. But ultimately that's what we need to do because we want people to be able to see exactly what we're trying to say. So have bravery and walk with me as we go through as we have bravery and walk with me as we have to show have to try to be really crystal clear in our communication. I just used a cliche. Okay, so another core part of the how to write a short paper essay is that I'm trying to prepare you here for writing in the working world. So if we think about it, I think some huge percentage of you are either going to work for a private corporation or business, a government department, or a non-government organization. And one of the things you probably don't realize as a student, but you'll learn very, very rapidly when you get into the working world, is that anything you write, there's only really two things that can happen to it, anything you write. Either your boss thinks it's good enough to give to their boss and publish it, or your boss has to rewrite your bloody work, right? And that is a very high standard because basically your boss needs to think that your work is as good as your boss has to think that your work is as good as theirs, and good enough to put their name on it. That's hard. It's hard for and that means that when you're writing now, like once you leave, like, you know, you can get away with a hell of a lot of rubbish while you're at university. But once you leave here, go pick up an annual report by a company, go pick up a press release by a company, go pick up a article in a newspaper or a government report, and simply ask yourself anything, any piece of professional writing, and say, could you write that? Because if you can't, then your boss is going to have to rewrite it or send it back to you. And that's how the real world works, and I want you to have a sense of how important that is. In the short paper that I provide in the essay, well, the first reading, I give an example of one of my top students, and I mean top students. She was like, I think she had the highest grade point average that I'd seen at the time. She got a job in one of the best government jobs, or the best government job in Singapore, which was with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she said, even though she was really a brilliant student, she co-authored actual articles with one of the academics from my department later. But she said in her first 6 months, she just got her writing torn to shreds, and her ego shredded as well in the first 6 months of the job. And you probably need to expect that that's going to happen to you, but you can reduce the pain of that if you, I would suggest, follow many of the rules that I'm outlining here today. Okay. So, that's introduction. If you want to remember one thing from reading number 1, it's simply this. The mind map from Tony Buzan is a good metaphor for excellent writing. That probably doesn't mean much to you at the moment, but when Tony Buzan talks about mind maps, this is the guy who invented mind maps. You know what a mind map is? It's like an octopus where you draw out a core idea, you put it at the center, and then you do a whole lot of lines out from it, breaking it down into smaller and smaller ideas, explaining whatever the core idea is. When you do a mind map, Tony Buzan says that there are 3 things that you need to do. One is it needs to have a tree structure, which means it's not a network. You can't notice on a tree, branches branch out, branches don't come back and connect with one another. So there is that tree structure. Second thing Tony Buzan says is that you need to put a word on each line, only a word on each branch of the tree. He wants it to be, which I say is a metaphor for the simplicity you need in writing. And then lastly, Tony Buzan says that what he wants you to do is to use color and pictures. And the reason he says to use color and pictures is because this is powerful imagery which helps memory and understanding. And for us, that vividness, the vividness of a mind map and the illustrations and drawings is really shows up in good quality non-fiction writing through the use of very simple, powerful examples and analogies and non-examples and even drawings. Okay, so let's go through that. So we're starting off by talking about structure. It turns out whereas a mind map, the structure is these tentacles of the kind of the octopus of the writing. The structure in an academic paper has really 2 levels, right? A paper is broken fundamentally into paragraphs, and then the paragraph itself is broken into sections. And we'll go through these step by step and show you what those are, and I'll show you what those are. But generally, paragraphs, they're broken down: introduction, body, conclusion. That's a very simple essay. You will have slightly different structures. For something like an academic paper, there's perhaps one higher level of structure, which is like the abstract, the introduction, the lit review, the methods, the results, and the discussion. But in many ways, underneath that, the structure and the core thing you need to think about is paragraphs. When we then think about a paragraph, when you develop an idea in your mind, when in your mind you think about a paragraph, I want you to conceptualize it not as sentences. What you need to think about paragraphs are as sections. And what sections there are within a paragraph depend on the purpose of a paragraph. The first paragraph of a say an introduction of an essay, a very simple introduction. We've talked about it before, is you cover things like, you cover what's the topic, why is it important and perhaps interesting, what are the competing explanations or the competing theories, and then how you'll test these. You might draw that out into a couple of paragraphs in a academic paper, but broadly, this is a sort of structure you're looking for with an intro paragraph. Another specialist type of paragraph is the conclusion paragraph. So at the end of an essay, many of the cases, this is also what you do in a slightly longer way in the discussion of a paper, of an academic paper. You basically restate the argument. I like to say that the conclusion of a paper, it's like the end of a, what do we call it? The end of a musical. Have you ever seen a musical? Do you know what they do at the end of a musical? They often, almost always, but very often, they come back and they re-sing the highlights of the best songs in the musical. Somehow it's an amalgam of these, and by doing this, it draws the watcher back to the best moments of the musical. And that's what you want to do with a conclusion. In a conclusion, it's like the last speaker in a debate. They're not allowed to introduce any new ideas, but somehow they need to do it all with a hell of a lot of freshness. And that's what you want to do. It's the highlight reel. So how do you do the highlight reel? Well, you restate the problem. Then you explain what the competing explanations were that you didn't know the answer to. And then you talk about how you discovered certain things. And in doing this, you'll bring out you'll remind the reader of why they bothered spending so much time reading your work. Okay, and then now the classic paragraph. The classic non-fiction paragraph has this structure, and this is by far the most important paragraph you need to learn to write, and by far the biggest problem I have when students write essays. A body paragraph has really just two parts, and this third conclusion is optional. The most important part of any non-fiction paragraph is the topic sentence. It is the first sentence of the paragraph, and it is essentially a summary of the paragraph. It says what summary is too strong a word. It says what the paragraph is about. Stephen King says that, the famous horror writer says, in nonfiction writing, the topic sentence is a contract with the reader. It is a promise to the reader that whatever is put in the topic sentence will be the only things that are covered in the rest of the paragraph, right? So go back when you finished writing your essay, as you're writing it, when you write your topic sentence, look at it and say, is this all I'm going to talk about? Yes or no? And if it's not, then you're breaking the rules. You need to break off the ideas and put them into new paragraphs. And maybe you're trying to say too many things. If you've got 15 things to say in that paragraph, or even 5, 1 point per paragraph is generally the rule, and that 1 point needs to be covered in the topic sentence. The rest of the body paragraph is generally an explanation or an example following that draws out and expands on that topic sentence. We can, and sometimes right at the end, we will have a conclusion which generally draws it all together, often relating it back to either the overarching point of the paper overall, or linking it to what the next point is going to be in the next paragraph. Okay, so to come back, we said that there were, remember, the mind map has 3 parts. The mind map has the structure, which is a tree, which we've talked about. And notice your essay has a structure of a tree. The main branches are the paragraphs, and then the sub branches are the sections of those paragraphs. The second point about a mind map is that it only has 1 word per branch. Now we can't have 1 word per paragraph, but what we can have is simplicity. And just to remind you, the third one is going to be do it in colors and pictures, and for us that's using vividness and examples. But let's stick with point 2 here. Point 2 is that you want simplicity. You want 1 word per branch. Einstein's got this famous quote which says, as simple as possible, but no simpler. So we're saying simple, but not simplistic. Some rules around simplicity are never use a long word when a short one will do. If you can cut out a word, cut it. Another one is to write to communicate. So many people who write badly do out of one of 2 things, or like one of them is just a sort of a sense of entitlement, as though you're writing for yourself. Look, if you're writing for yourself, get out a diary, write all you want there, no one else will have to read it, right? But if you're not writing in a diary, then think about the reader. Good writers think about the reader. Good writers have a very clear idea of who their audience is, what they know, what they don't know, and how you can convey that information to them. So, and I have to say to you, I've had, over the years, had so many students who are incredibly intelligent, but ultimately they wrote like pretentious human beings. I wanted to use Australianism, but I'm not going to use it. But they wrote like a pretentious person who uses long, complicated, convoluted language that makes them sound smart. This is not how good writers write. This is how people who are pretentious writers, and pretentious, notice, comes from the word pretend. That's how pretenders write. Good writers write to communicate. They write simply. They write clearly, and that's what we need you to do. Okay, another element of simplicity, and I think this is probably the most powerful thing. If you can learn one technique, learning this is a pretty good one. This technique is called parallel construction, and the idea is that if you are stating similar points, say within a paragraph, if you are saying that there are 3 points, then when you express each of those 3 points, express them using the same words and substituting in, changing only the words that are similar. This contradicts, and there's examples within the readings, I'm not going to go into them now, but there are examples both within Strunk and White and within my paper. The most simple example of parallel construction is to say firstly, secondly, thirdly, right? But that's a very simplistic, that's a very simple form of parallel construction. More complex ones would use things like let me think. In the qualitative survey, for the qualitative part of our survey, we use the method of thematic analysis. For the quantitative part of our survey, we analyze it using the methods of statistics. That's something like that. Notice what I've done there. There's two sentences, and I'm talking about qualitative questions and then analysis with thematic analysis, and then quantitative questions with statistical analysis. If we treat those as two sentences or two parts of a sentence, notice that we've kept similar things in similar places. This contradicts one of the things that you're probably taught by your high school English teacher, which is not to repeat yourself. And when your high school English teacher says not to repeat yourself, they don't mean this. What they mean is don't repeat words like I am doing now. I keep using the word, I think I keep using the words basically, and things like a few other really annoying verbal tics that I have. Your high school English teacher, he or she, is right about that. Don't repeat those kind of words. But remember, when you're doing social science writing and non-fiction writing, while you shouldn't repeat verbal tics and you shouldn't use unfresh language, what you should try to do as much as possible is, when you are saying things that are very similar, using a similar sentence structure makes it much easier for the reader to follow. So I gave that example of the quantitative questions, qualitative, if I rewrote that just to give an example of where it would be more complicated, you might say, I'm going to make it a bit different. I'm going to say, I use thematic analysis to analyze the questions based in words, in other questions that were answered with words. And then you might say, for the quantitative questions, I used various forms of statistical analysis, including tables and regressions. So when I've done that, which is a sort of a second example, they're not balanced, and it's harder to see that there's actually a parallel between these two parts. Anyway, I think I'm overcomplicating it here. Go have a read. Point is, at this stage, if you didn't get what I'm saying, go read the sections on parallel construction or coordinate ideas in similar form in readings 1 and 2. Super important. Okay, so we've said the first 2 points were structure of a tree, simplicity of language and style and writing. Third point, vividness. This is the analogy in a mind map is that you color in your mind map, you use pictures on your mind map. Well, the equivalent of that when you're writing is using vivid language. It makes your work memorable, it anchors it in the real world, and it's done through using examples, analogies, drawings, and non-examples. In many cases, these are really very, very simple. It's not that examples should be long, right? And sometimes an example can just be a word or two. at the end of a sentence that draws out what we mean by some word that seems quite abstract. We might say, for example, I'm just draw one out, that we might say in an essay, we expect people of similar social status to be friends. Okay, you heard that, and you kind of know what social status is. But if I said it this way, if I used an example at the end, so I said, then it will be much clearer. We expect people of similar social status to be friends. For example, we expect we expect the factory worker to be friends with perhaps the plumber, and we expect the doctor to be friends with lawyers. Now, that's classist, and there's tons of things wrong with that, but by giving that example, at least I make clear what I mean by social status, right? So good examples, they have these qualities. Good examples, analogies, illustrations are non-examples. Firstly, they're short. They're as short as possible. A word. They're generally memorable. So, and to be memorable, they need to be fresh. They can't be overused. And we'll learn a bit more about that when we learn from Orwell. They should be ample in scope, so they should cover the core elements of whatever concept you're trying to explain. They need to be original. That relates to memorability, because if they're not, they're already dead, right? I mean, I'm going to use examples later. The shining star. She was like a shining star. It's like, oh my God. Not only do you want to puke when you hear unoriginal things, nothing appears in your mind when you hear that. Whereas when you say, when something original is used, such as, oh God, I can't think of an example. But when someone uses something original, it is quite powerful. And often they're very clarifying and not confusing. I'll give an example. Let me just say this. It turns out that this is related to this, which is that examples just to help things really stay in your head. I'll give you one example. Let me give one more example. One example of using something vivid. I can say when I go to airports, I'm just horrified by how commercialized they are. Okay, you heard that. Whatever. But I can make it much more memorable and evocative and clear if I say to you, and again, this is just simple, but like when I recently went to the airport, I couldn't believe I found it hard to believe how commercialized it was. It was full of Toblerone. It was full of Toblerone, Baileys, and various parts of kangaroos that were being sold for between $20 and $50 just to make a buck out of tourists. Whatever. I mean, maybe that works, maybe that doesn't work. I don't know. But my point is that you've now got sort of stuck in your head those very. When I say commercialized, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, the chocolates and the alcohol and the various parts of Australian animals that are being sold. Okay, I'll go into a couple of things. Like most of the time, 99% of the time we just use examples, but there are some really powerful things that we can use that are not examples, that are slightly different for vividness, and often they're used unconsciously. So one of them, I'll give an example, or not you don't see it explicitly. So you don't say, so this, for example, let me give you an example of a non-example. So silly. So non-examples, right? There's three I'm going to go through: non-examples, drawings, and analogies. So a non-example is something that is almost exactly the same as is almost an example, but it's missing one vital element of the concept, and so and because of that it fails. Non-examples are really powerful for illustrating how certain concepts, how certain elements of a concept, certain parts of a definition are vital for explaining what that is. So, or for making that what it is. So I'll just give you an example. Okay. I'll give you an example of a non-example. So let's say I want to explain to you what a man is. A male human being. I want to explain to you what a man is, and I'll say a non-example of a man is a boy, and you're like, oh, right. When I give you the example of a man and a boy, what I draw out in that is that is the role of age. So a man is someone who is a mature adult, right, and a boy. So I draw out that key element. When I use a different non-example and I say I want to explain what a man is, by drawing contrast with with that of a woman, well, then I'm pointing out the difference in having an XY chromosome or XX chromosome, or maybe that's kind of sexist these days, having perhaps having certain secondary sexual characteristics, or some sort of concept within one's mind of what gender one is. Again, the non-example helps the two different non-examples of a man draw out what we're trying to talk about here. If we talk about it in a more, let's be more sociological about it. This is maybe a tough example, but let me just humor me. So Marx and Weber talk about what social class is. So Marx says social class is defined by a group of people's relationship to basically the economy, the means of production, so a worker doesn't own capital, and so therefore has to rent themselves, whereas a capitalist does own capital, and these are two classes. Weber says no. Class is defined by relationship of a common life chances to a particular market. It's like, ooh, what does that mean? And so Weber says that it can actually be debtors, so people who own. So you as students, actually, it's because you students are part of one class, because after you graduate, your life chances are going to be determined by going into a pretty similar labour market in Australia or Sydney and trying to get a job. And so in that way, you are seen by Weber as having a similar being of a similar class. Now you say, well, what's the difference between these two notions, right, of Weber and Marx? What's the difference between the means of production in relationship to a market? Well, I say, okay, let's take the example of slaves. For Weber, for Marx, slaves are a class. Why are they a class? Because they've got the same relationship to the means of production, right? They basically don't have control over it. They are made to work. their relationship to the economy is is very similar. But for Weber, they're not. Why? Because their life chances are not determined by relationship to a market. Their life chances are determined by what? The fact that they were put into slavery, right? And whatever their owners want to do with them. Now, they could be sold on a market, but they're still owned no matter whether they're sold or not. So maybe that example doesn't work for you, but in this case, slaves are used as a non-example of a Weberian class. Complicated, but nonetheless. Okay, analogies. Analogies are used quite a lot. Read the Bible, they're incredibly powerful, and they're used a lot to communicate with people. The main reason you use analogies is because you've got a complicated idea that you just can't quite get across to people without using something like an analogy. If I'm trying to give an analogy, we'll talk about later with George Orwell. With George Orwell, he talks about how you can't tell whether bad writing creates bad ideas and a bad culture, and bad politics and a bad society, or whether it's the bad society that creates the bad ideas and the bad language. Now, you might be saying, well, what does he mean by that? Well, you could use an analogy which is very old and cliched and broken of the chicken and the egg. And so you're saying we don't know whether it's, which came first, because in a sense they could each give rise to one another. That's a bit of a stupid analogy, but it's one. A better analogy, okay, so the way most students screw up with analogies, if I can point it out, is that they use analogies for concepts that are pretty bloody obvious, right? So I guess what I just gave was a bad example of the use of an analogy. So we don't need you to say I'm explaining what a large firm and a small firm is. They're like a large chicken and a small chicken, or a large pig and a small pig. It's like, no kidding, right? Like, we don't need you to use an analogy to explain size. We get it the first time. But let me give you. This is one of my favorites from Jesus, right? Jesus wants to explain how difficult it is to get into heaven. Sorry, not just to get into heaven, how difficult it is for a rich person to get into heaven, right? And Jesus could have said, look, it's really hard for a rich man to get into heaven because they do so many bad things, and they have so many privileges they don't act on, and opportunities they have to make a better world, and they waste them. So it's very hard for them to get into heaven, and they have many opportunities to do evil by their common man. So it's very hard for a rich person to get into heaven. And you're like, okay, fine, whatever. I guess it's hard. But Jesus wants to explain. You all know what Jesus says, probably, if you're familiar with the Bible. Jesus says, no, let me explain to you how difficult it is. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get to heaven. Now, there's actually some funny historical background to that, which is about some temple in the Middle East. I'm not going to go into, but let's just take it at face value. How easy is it to get a camel through the eye of a needle? A real camel through a real eye of a needle? It's almost impossible, right? You could put the camel through the eye of a needle, but it is no longer a camel. It's kind of mincemeat, right? So that as an analogy explains what difficulty really is. It's very, 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 very hard. according to Jesus, for a rich man to make it into heaven. Okay. Drawings. I'm not going to go into this, but there are some fun examples in the reading number 1. They're both. It's actually an illustrated guide that one of my students put together some great illustrations for. There's also a pretty good book on how to draw, though I think it's a bit of a funny one. It's kind of like it's like a 200-page book on how to draw simply and communicate quickly. It's like a 200-page book on brevity. It's like, yeah, if you understood what brevity meant, you wouldn't need to write a 200-page book. But anyway. Okay, so that's the end of reading number 1. The other 2 I'll try and go through quicker. So, reading number 2, Strunk and White, the elementary principles of composition. So, this, as I said, this is the classic text given to journalists and most other writers who write professionally. They have these 2 people have several really key principles, which I'll go through. The first one is choose a suitable design and hold it. So the first thing you do when you write is decide what the structure is. That structure gives you then the buckets to put your words and ideas in. When I write a paper, academic paper, and I've picked the journal, often I will go through that journal and pick some articles that I think are similar to what mine are, and check the word length for each of the various sections they have. The reason I do this is just to get a sense of what I should be aiming for within that structure. Similarly, you can do that with a essay you're doing. Often, if you think if 2,000 or 3,000 word essay might seem long to you, but if it's 200 words per paragraph, that's 10 paragraphs. And you only get to make about 1 point per paragraph. So if you've got a 2,000 word essay, you've got 10 points to make. Actually, you've got less because you've got an intro and a conclusion. So what are your 8 points? Notice how choosing a suitable design and then holding it forces a level of focus on and simplification of the problem that you've got simply through basic planning. Okay, Strunk and White say make the paragraph the unit of composition, and remember there's 1 idea per paragraph, and also think that most paragraphs should be about the same length and they should logically progress. Simple points, hard to follow. Okay, third point, use the active voice. So you say X did Y. You don't say Y was done to X. Have the subject do things to the object. There's a whole lot of examples here. You can read them at your own time. Put statements in the positive form. Again, this relates to the issue of bravery. It's much easier and completely and utterly insipid to use the word not. And I would encourage you to use that word with yourself. Ask yourself, when I'm writing here, am I being insipid? Because if you are being insipid, if you are being timid, if you are avoiding, then you're probably inserting the word not a lot into your sentences. And it hurts it. It makes it less concise, and what we want to know is what you think, not what you don't think. Another way to write powerfully and clearly is to use definite and specific and concrete language. In one of the rules I have, which is use nouns, not adjectives. Use verbs, not adjectives. So don't intensify with lots of verys and an adjective, like various adjectival words, adjectives. Instead, simply use let your nouns and verbs do the work. There's an example here. I don't know where I got it from. I probably should reference it. I apologize for not referencing this in advance. In summary, I find the materialistic approach propagated by Marx more convincing due to its reflection and observable. This is the bad example. I'm not going to read it. It's too long. Let's read the good one. In summary, Marx's materialism provides a powerful explanation of how superstructures, the media, church, government bodies, and people's everyday thoughts are driven by the capitalist system they're embedded in. In contrast, Weber's idealism provides a weak explanation of how capitalism is a product of religion. The church is a weak actor in modern capitalism, and the explanatory power of Weber is equally weak. Oof, brutal, but clear, specific, concrete. Okay, omit needless words. If you can omit a word, do it. It's like, this is such a powerful writing technique that that everyone should follow it. Simple as that. This is a so this rule basically says that if you've got lots of sentences that have and, but, while, with, and things like this inside of them, then you're writing badly. This is an example here from Strunk White. Look, the key thing, I've been thinking about this a bit, because I think I haven't really ever taught this properly. I was looking up online at different people who tried to rewrite this paragraph to do a good, a better paragraph, because I don't think Strunk White rewrote it. It turns out it can't really be, I don't think it can be rewritten as a good paragraph. And the reason is this. Loose sentences have got so much going on inside them. Often they really need to be broken into multiple paragraphs. So loose sentences say things like, well, here, the third concise of the subscription series was given last evening and a large audience was in attendance. Well, when you read that sentence, it's like, what's your point? Is it about the third concert? Is it about last evening? Or is it about the large audience that was in attendance? What's your point here, right? And the second one is better. Mr. Edward Appleton was the soloist and the symphony orchestra furnished the instrumental music. That's okay, because they're sort of doing similar things. But again, it ends up doing it's just doing a hell of a lot when really you probably want to keep it simpler. And you probably also want to break it up. Okay. Express coordinate ideas in similar form. This is what I've already talked about in the previous, so I won't repeat it. But remember, variety is not the spice of good writing. Don't separate related words with long clauses and phrases. Straightforward. In summaries, keep to one tense. Tense is much more difficult than most people imagine, and it's not straightforward, especially when writing an academic paper. But yeah, if you get confused on tenses, go and read a model paper. And in fact, that's my main advice, actually. My main advice is if you're writing something, just go and find a model and then follow that form. Every piece of writing, I'm talking about, like, you got to go give a wedding speech, go find a good wedding speech. You'll notice there's a particular structure to them. If you've got to, have to give a TED talk, go copy the structure of a TED talk. If you have to write an essay, go find a good essay. If you've got to write an academic article, go find some good academic articles and study them. And that relates back to this point simply because when you're writing, many times it's hard to know which tense to use. If someone else has published with it, they probably got the tenses right. Okay, this is just a funny rule about how good sentences tend to end with the most emphatic words. You can read these examples. I'll just read. I like the death and taxes one. Death and taxes are the only things certain in this life. That's not a good sentence. The only things certain in this life are death and taxes. So whatever's important, if you put it at the end of the sentence, if you put the important words at the end of the sentence, boom, it hits hard. So there's Strunk and White. I've gone through those quite quickly. Okay, the last reading. This is going to be, again, we're going to be pretty quick. So George Orwell, Politics in the English Language. This, when you start reading this, you'll be like, where the hell is he going with it? But as it gets going, it gets much more to the point, and in the end, it ends with 6 simple rules, which are, I think, brilliant. So let's just go through it. I'm going to just turn this into 2 slides. So Orwell says there are 4 problems with a current writing. It uses dead imagery, so such and such was a shining star. It's one of my favorite examples. But overused metaphors end up becoming dead in the mind and end up evoking nothing, and therefore not doing what it's like. It's like some clip art. It kind of fails because you've seen it so many times. Secondly, padding with wordy phrases. So people constantly pad their language with wordy phrases rather than simply use straightforward verbs and nouns that mean the same thing. So you might say give rise to, you can just say cause. Often they use pretentious diction, so you talk about the phenomenon, which you may as well say the thing. You should be more specific about what you're actually talking about, and probably you can say it much more simply. So she was a marvelous phenomenon. She was a marvelous actor. Okay, that phenomenon was an action. The phenomenon you were talking about was acting. Meaningless words as well. So many words, unfortunately, particularly in political discourse, but not just political discourse, have lost their meaning because they are so overused. And we need to be aware when we're using these, and we often need to use different language and more precise language and less that actually allows us to say what we mean and differentiate it from what we don't mean. So Orwell's 6 solutions are awesome. So never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Another way to say that is don't use cliches. Never use cliches. Don't use cliches. Cliches kill. They kill the soul of the reader and me when I have to read them. Never use a long word when a short one will do. If it's possible to cut a word, cut it out. Never use the passive where you can use the active voice. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or jargon when you can think of an everyday English example. and break any of these rules sooner than saying anything outright barbarous. If we look at these and relate them to what we've read before, most of them are in Strunk White or in the first paper by me, How to Write a Short Paper. I think if we look here, that really the first one is really about how you do vividness, and the next 4 are really about how you keep your writing simple. And I think Orwell doesn't really focus on structure so much, but I imagine what he would say is that if you make it simple and vivid, the structure will often start to solve itself. Also, Orwell is writing as an essayist, and essayists have a little bit more freedom of structure than we do when we're writing, say, academic articles. Okay, I'm just going to go through the 2 exercises now before wrapping up. So these are for the external and OUA students. Just pick one of them. You don't have to do both. And post it online. If you owe them, remember you only have to do 6 for the whole semester, and they're all due at the end of semester, so you don't have to do it now. And we'll be going through these in class. If you're in class, I'd like you to bring along one of your previous essays that you've written or written work that you've done in another class. Hopefully a really bad one. That would be awesome, because then we can all talk about how we've failed, but now we're getting better. But the reason I want a bad one is because I want you to type out a paragraph from it, particularly bad paragraph, and then I want you to rewrite it following the advice from this week's readings. And then the third thing I want you to do, so you'll have 3 things. You'll have the paragraph, the bad paragraph, a good version of the paragraph, and then just make some bullet points or maybe write a paragraph explaining what you did badly in the original paragraph and what rules you followed to rewrite the new paragraph. Again, the point of 3 is to try to make you start using and applying the language and concepts from this week. Often we need to do those things explicitly so that we have, so our brains are sort of not just, you can't just hear what you see in this lecture or read what you've, what have in the readings, but you need to be able to use them, and by explaining what you've done, you'll draw that out really well. Okay, exercise 2, which is it's a different option, but in it you have the opportunity to read an article that I've written, or I'll put up as an example on the iLearn. It's an article that I wrote. It is a mixed method study from the Journal of Immigrant and Minority Health. It's on the mental health of migrant workers in Singapore. What I want you to do is just pick a section. You don't have to read the whole thing, though I would suggest looking over it for a few different things, such as, because there's examples of how to write up a quantitative and a qualitative study. What I'd like you to do is to read a section of it, pick the abstract, say, and then ask yourself, I want you to say, does Nick's article, or that section of Nick's article, follow the advice of this week's readings? And find some examples of where I follow the advice and examples where I don't follow the advice. I think this is very useful because I'm not perfect and you get to tell me where I'm wrong, but there are probably some quite useful things in there as well to learn from, because I do try. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture. Hope this has been useful. I look forward to seeing you in class or online sometime soon. Cheers. Bye.